Elijah Marsh was mid-sentence, reviewing quarterly numbers with his assistant, when he stopped speaking entirely. One hand rose slowly to his chest. His assistant, a woman named Carla who had worked for him for 11 years, saw the color leave his face in the span of a single breath and was already reaching for the phone before he hit the floor. "I need an ambulance," she said, her voice steady, despite the specific controlled panic of someone trained, over years, to handle emergencies calmly. "Marsh Holdings, 42nd floor. My boss is having a heart attack." Security arrived within 90 seconds. The office around Elijah's collapsed body erupted into the specific organized chaos of a company whose founder had just become, without warning, its most urgent problem. Across town, in a different office on a different floor of the same building, Gregory Vance received the call, informing him that Elijah Marsh had been hospitalized. Gregory sat with the phone still in his hand for a long moment after the call ended. His expression, alone in his office with no one watching, moved through something that resembled concern for perhaps 3 seconds, before shifting into something colder, more calculating. The specific, immediate recalculation of a man who had spent 20 years waiting, without fully admitting it to himself, for exactly this kind of opening. "Get legal on the phone," he said to his own assistant. Now, 3 floors down, in a smaller office with a view of the parking structure rather than the skyline, Malik Marsh received a different call entirely. "Malik, it's Carla. Your father collapsed. They're taking him to St. Vincent's. You need to come now." Malik was on his feet and moving before the call had fully ended. His laptop left open on his desk, his chair still rolling from the force of standing so fast. 15 years earlier, Elijah Marsh had made the most important decision of his life in a homeless shelter, not a boardroom. He had no idea that decision was about to be the only thing standing between his company and the man he'd trusted for 20 years. If something about this moment already has your attention, if you can feel the weight of what's coming, hit the like button right now. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we tell stories like this one every single week. Drop your country in the comments and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Now, let's go back 15 years, to the night this family actually began. Elijah Marsh had been successful for years by the time he first walked into the Riverside Community Shelter on a Tuesday evening, volunteering not for publicity, which he actively avoided, declining every reporter who ever asked about it, but because something in that specific work mattered to him more than almost anything else he'd built. He understood instability in a way most people around him, by that point in his career, did not. His own adolescence had included a period after his mother's death when nothing about his living situation felt permanent, bounced between relatives who took him in out of obligation rather than love. The specific, permanent memory of being a child whom adults discussed as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be claimed. He had built Marsh Holdings, in part, because financial security felt like the only kind of permanence he could guarantee for himself. But by his late 30s, already wealthy enough that further growth was optional, Elijah had begun spending Tuesday evenings at the shelter instead of at another business dinner. That particular Tuesday, he noticed an 8-year-old boy sitting alone near the far wall, deliberately unremarkable, the specific stillness of a child who had learned, correctly, that drawing attention rarely led anywhere good. The boy's mother had died 8 months earlier from an illness that had gone untreated for lack of resources. 2 foster placements had already failed, not through any fault of the boy's, simply the specific bureaucratic churn of a system stretched too thin to properly match children with families equipped to keep them. Elijah did not feel pity looking at that boy. He felt recognition. Within weeks, he had begun the adoption process. Within 8 months, Malik Marsh had a new last name, a new bedroom in Elijah's home, and the beginning, slow, difficult, genuinely uncertain in those early months, of a permanence neither of them had ever fully trusted before. The first year was hard. Malik tested constantly, in the specific way of a child checking whether this, too, would prove temporary. Small acts of defiance, long silences, the particular guardedness of someone protecting himself from a disappointment he'd already survived twice. Elijah's patience never once wavered. He showed up. Every day, every difficult conversation, every school event, every 2 a.m. nightmare, Elijah was there, consistently, without exception, until slowly, over years rather than months, Malik stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. There was Malik's first day at his new school, standing at the door in a uniform 2 sizes too big. Elijah crouched down beside him, adjusting his collar. There was his high school graduation. Elijah in the front row, unable to fully keep his composure despite 30 years of practiced business calm. There was his decision, at 18, to study business and finance. Not because Elijah pushed him toward the company, which he deliberately never did, but because Malik wanted, with real specificity, to eventually be useful to the man who had given him everything. Elijah kept him at arm's length from Marsh Holdings for years after graduation, wanting Malik's path there, if he chose it, to be genuinely earned rather than handed to him. Malik started as a junior analyst 2 years ago, in an unremarkable role, respected by the people who worked with him directly, but not yet tested at any real scale. The night before Elijah's collapse, father and son had dinner together, the way they did most weeks. Elijah, almost in passing, mentioned that he trusted Malik's judgment completely, a sentence that meant nothing extraordinary in the moment, and that Malik would remember, within 24 hours, with enormous weight. Malik arrived at the hospital to find his father stable but sedated. A mild heart attack, recoverable, but requiring genuine rest. The attending physician was direct. Any significant stress in the coming days could meaningfully endanger Elijah's recovery. Malik sat beside his father's bed, holding his hand, feeling a specific fear he had carried quietly since he was 8 years old rising up in his chest. The fear that the one permanent thing in his life could still, somehow, be taken away. His phone buzzed. An urgent notice from the company's legal department. Gregory Vance had called an emergency board session, citing Elijah's incapacitation and invoking a governance clause permitting temporary executive authority to shift to the COO during a founder's medical absence. Malik read the notice twice, his hand still holding his father's. He understood, with immediate and complete clarity, exactly what Gregory Vance was attempting to do. Malik walked into the boardroom an hour later, the youngest person present by nearly 2 decades, still in the same clothes he'd worn to work that morning before his entire day had changed shape completely. Gregory Vance sat already positioned at the head of the table, barely glancing up as Malik entered. "This is a board matter," Gregory said. "I appreciate your concern for your father, but this isn't the appropriate forum." "I have standing to be here," Malik said, his voice steady, despite everything happening beneath the surface. "I'm a shareholder and an employee of this company. A junior analyst," Gregory said, not quite dismissive, but close enough that several board members exchanged brief, uncertain glances. I understand this is difficult for you personally. Let the board handle this. Nobody in the room was hostile toward Malik exactly. They simply, genuinely, did not yet understand what actual standing a 23-year-old junior analyst had in this specific room, regardless of whose son he happened to be. Gregory proceeded with the vote. It passed, narrowly, several board members abstaining out of confusion rather than genuine support, uncertain enough about the sudden circumstances to avoid taking a firm position either way. Malik left the boardroom having said everything he could think to say, and it had not been enough. Right here, before Malik finds what he's looking for, subscribe if you haven't already, because the next few hours are the entire reason this story exists. Hit the bell. Drop your country in the comments. We're reading every single one. Now, watch what 15 years of quiet observation actually prepared him for. Malik returned to the hospital that evening and sat again beside his sedated father, the company Elijah had built over 3 decades now, functionally, sitting in Gregory Vance's hands. He looked at his father's still face and felt the old fear fully surface, the specific, permanent fear he had carried since he was 8 years old, that anything given to him completely could still, somehow, be taken away by people with more power than he had. This was the lowest point of the entire ordeal, not because anything worse was happening to Elijah physically, but because everything Elijah had built, everything that represented the exact security and permanence he'd given Malik 15 years earlier, was now sitting in the hands of a man who had made it unmistakably clear, in a single boardroom exchange, exactly how little he believed Malik actually mattered. Malik sat with that feeling for a long time. Then he remembered something. A conversation months earlier. Elijah, almost offhandedly, teaching rather than testing, walking Malik through the company's original founding documents on a quiet Sunday afternoon neither of them had thought much about since. The specific, decades-old bylaws Elijah had written personally when the company was young, before the board had grown to its current size, before Gregory Vance had ever been hired. Malik opened his laptop. He spent the entire night reading governance structures, founding provisions, the specific legal architecture Elijah had built into the company from its very earliest days, most of it untouched and unexamined by the current board for years. He found it just before dawn. A clause, buried in paperwork most current board members had never actually read in full, requiring that any transfer of executive authority during a founder's incapacitation be approved not merely by board vote, but by the founder's designated successor trust, a trust Elijah had quietly established years earlier, naming Malik as trustee the exact moment he turned 21. Gregory's vote had been legally void from the moment it happened. Malik called the company's outside legal counsel at 6 in the morning. "I need you to review something," he said. "And then I need you standing beside me in front of the board by 9. Malik walked into the boardroom at 9, outside counsel beside him, the same room where he'd been dismissed less than 24 hours earlier. Except this time, his posture carried something different. The specific steadiness of a man who had finally found exactly where he stood. "Yesterday's vote granting Mr. Vance temporary executive authority is invalid," Malik said. His voice was steady, measured, carrying the exact same calm his father had built an entire company on. Under the company's original founding bylaws, any transfer of executive authority during Elijah Marsh's incapacitation requires approval from the founder's designated successor trust. He placed a document on the table. "I've held that trusteeship since I turned 21. Nobody consulted me before yesterday's vote. Gregory's expression moved rapidly through disbelief into something colder. This is absurd. You're a junior analyst using a legal technicality to… I'm the trustee my father named specifically to protect this company from exactly this situation, Malik said, cutting through without raising his voice. And I'd like the board to formally review the circumstances under which Mr. Vance called an emergency session within hours of my father's hospitalization, before consulting the appropriate governance structure that's been sitting in this company's own founding documents for 30 years. The room's attention reorganized itself completely, board members exchanging glances of an entirely different quality now. The specific, rapid recalculation of people understanding, in real time, exactly what had actually happened the day before, and exactly whose judgment had been correct. The board reversed the previous day's vote within the hour. An internal investigation was opened into Gregory Vance's conduct, the specific speed and timing of his emergency session, called within hours of his mentor's hospitalization, raising questions the board was no longer willing to set aside. Gregory's employment was suspended pending review, and within weeks, formally terminated, not through public spectacle, but through the same legitimate governance process Malik had used to stop him in the first place. Elijah, recovering steadily, learned the full story only once he was strong enough for the complete conversation. Malik sat beside his hospital bed, walking him through everything. The board meeting, the discovery of the founding documents, the trust. You found the clause, Elijah said, quiet, something in his voice carrying a pride that had nothing to do with the company itself. You taught me the clause, Malik said. Months ago. I don't think you even remember doing it. Elijah was quiet for a long moment, studying his son's face. I remember everything I've ever taught you, he said finally. I just didn't fully understand you were listening that closely. I've been listening my whole life, Malik said. Weeks later, fully recovered, Elijah walked back into Marsh Holdings for the first time since the collapse, not alone. Malik walked beside him, no longer positioned as a junior analyst, but announced, formally, by Elijah himself, in front of the full assembled staff. I didn't build this company to hand it to someone, Elijah said, his voice carrying across the room with the same steady authority it always had. I built it, in part, so that someone like my son would never have to wonder if he belonged somewhere permanent. He looked at Malik beside him. He proved this month that he belongs here completely, not because he's my son, because he earned it, in the exact way I always hoped he would, whether he ever worked here or not. Malik stood beside his father, the same quiet composure he'd carried since he was 8 years old, sitting alone against a shelter wall. Finally, fully understanding something he'd spent 15 years quietly afraid to fully believe. The permanence his father had given him had never actually been in question. It never had been. If Elijah and Malik's story stayed with you, if you understand what it means to be chosen completely, and to spend a lifetime proving that choice was worth making, share this video right now with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we bring you stories like this one every single week. Hit that like button if this one got you, and drop a comment below, where in the world are you watching from? We read every single one, and we want to know who's out there carrying stories like Elijah and Malik carried theirs. Until next time, what you build out of love always outlasts what someone else tries to take through resentment.